Hi, it's Ela, and I am going to talk to you about the difference between watercolor and other types of paint media. So here I have a piece of watercolor paper and I have a black line, and I'm going to show you the difference between things like acrylic, and I've got some blobs of acrylic over here, and I have some watercolor over here, and how do they differ? So with acrylic paint, and this is true for gouache and oil as well, the paint is usually, most colors are somewhat opaque. So here's some paint, and it's thick, and it's blobby and gooey. It's like three-dimensional. And there's types of acrylic that are more liquid, but it's not unusual to see a thick, impasto, gooey acrylic blob, and you can see the shape of the brush strokes when I lay them down. And if I were to paint over a black line, it's covered up. You can maybe faintly see it a little bit, but it's fairly opaque. And if I wanted to make this paint lighter, I would probably go and use some white paint and mix the white paint in with that blue, and then I could make a lighter shade of blue. And wherever I it's like you've got gooey paint, nothing's moving, right? There's no blending. I have to use the brush to blend the colors together. So this is pretty typical for acrylic and for other types of medium as well. Now, if I'm going to paint with watercolor, watercolor behaves a lot differently, very differently. First of all, there's no scooping up. When you get a set like this, the paint comes dry in a pan, and it's kind of hard, and you have to activate it with water to get it to move. If you were to get a tube like this, I would want to be very sparing about how much paint I use. You don't need hardly any paint. You can see this is blue, but it looks black. It's not till I add the water to it that you can really see what this color looks like. This color is a little bit closer to this one, so I'm using it. It actually has a little bit of white mixed in, which is unusual. But it's very flat, it's very glossy. If I tilt it, the paint kind of runs down in the direction that I tilt the paper. It's watercolor. If I add a bunch of water to it, that's how we get a paler shade of blue. It's not white paint. It's just diluting it will get you the color you want. There is some white paint that comes in your palette, but by and large, watercolorists don't use white paint very much. I only use it for certain special effects. I mean, you can see if I use white paint to make a paler blue, it has a very different sort of quality to it. It's kind of got a more of a muddy quality as opposed to this very transparent sort of quality. This is what we think of when we think of watercolor. We think of this sort of effect. It's why we're drawn to watercolor. It's literally the paper is shining through. It's like light shining through. And it's lovely. So that's what's wonderful and special about watercolor. Now here's another thing. So this would be considered what's called wet into wet technique. I have a bunch of water here, and I have a bunch of pigment here, and they're flowing together. You could also do wet into wet technique by having two colors side by side like this. So here I've got some red, and then I could take that blue again, and if I lay them side by side, look how they flow. They immediately flow together. This doesn't flow. This can't flow. But this immediately starts moving, and I can coax it and make it move even more if I want. Encourage, and I'm also being very careful. Like I rinse out my brush. I'm going to use my fingers, but you can dry it with a paper towel. If I don't wipe that water off, then I'm going to add more water and accidentally dilute those colors. But see, I'm swirling back and forth. And it just kind of does this sort of cool effect, and you're getting sort of this purple here. And you can move the paint around, and then paint's going to move on its own while you're not looking. It just, all sorts of things are happening. So it's kind of alive. Now, let's say you don't want your colors to flow like this. Let's say you want your paint to keep still. If you want your paint to keep still, you can see how the edge here is very sharp and clear. If you want two colors next to each other and not have them flow, like here's some blobs of colors that I did earlier, you let it dry, and you have to make sure that it's really, really dry. I will often use a hair dryer. You can put it in the sun if it's a sunny day. You can leave it alone, let it sit for several minutes, but you want to make sure, this may even be not as, I think this is going to be dry enough. So if I go ahead with that blue again, and I paint right up next to it, you can see how they're not flowing together. They're staying separate. So I'm painting on a dry surface. If I wanted to overlap, if I wanted to layer colors, I can lay colors on top of each other. But this is a transparent medium. So you can see that orange shape shining through that blue. It's different than if I was going to do acrylic. So you can do all sorts of fun experiments, either layering colors, putting colors side by side, or blending them together. So this is working on dry paper. This is wet to wet. If you mess with your picture too long, this is one more thing. Let's see if I can make it happen on purpose. Yes, it's doing it. So this has been sitting for a while. I put some water, and now this water is pushing this paint, and it's creating, it looks kind of like a cauliflower. It's kind of cool looking, but sometimes it happens when you don't want it to. This is called a back run. So if you get this sort of effect, then you know you've been messing with your painting for too long. You were trying to do wet to wet, right? But your paper began to dry out. This first layer was getting too dry. You put a really wet layer on top, and it started pushing against the dry, and then you get this sort of pattern. So maybe you can do that on purpose. Maybe it's something you can enjoy and embrace, and sometimes you're like, I just don't want that. So anyway, there it is. There's a quick summary of how does watercolor work.